Hello members, welcome back to Mary Bateman, the Yorkshire Witch. We're now at the end of a crooked road. Despite his wife's entreaties, shortly before she died, William Perigo took it upon himself to send for a surgeon from Leeds, a Mr. Chorley. But as word of Mrs. Perigo's death reached him before he actually arrived in Bramley, it wasn't until the day after his wife's death that Perigo paid a visit to the surgeon himself. On examining his patient and taking into account the symptoms described, Mr. Chorley drew the conclusion that poison had been ingested. As a means of proof, Mr. Chorley suggested that some of the flour used in the last fateful pudding be made up into a paste fed to a chicken to see what harm befell it. Whether or not the flour used was untainted or the test subject had a lucky escape, the chicken suffered no ill effects from the experiment. However, a cat, which being experimentally fed some of the cooked pudding by the Perigo's neighbours, did die immediately. And though Mr. Chorley's suspicions were clearly aroused, no further steps were taken to ascertain the real cause of Rebecca's death at that time. No autopsy was performed on her body. Chorley did later perform an autopsy on the body of a dog which has died as a result of being fed pills and a solution made from honey that the couple were directed to take. There was poison in the animal's stomach. After his wife's death, William went into Leeds to tell Mary that Rebecca had died. Mary's surprising and admonishing reaction was that Rebecca's life would have been preserved had she licked up all of the special honey as directed in Miss Blythe's letter. When William inferred that it was in fact the honey that had caused his wife's death, an angry Mary remonstrated that if he would bring her what was left of the jar of honey, she would lick it up before his eyes and satisfy him. What she would have done had William called her bluff, we can only guess at, though she would have thought of something. Incredibly, even after his wife's death, William Perigo seemed willing to continue his subjugation to Miss Blythe, and not long after this confrontation, he received another letter from the lady, commiserating on Rebecca's death, but nonetheless blaming her demise and the threat to her own and Mary Bateman's lives on Rebecca, having touched of those things which I ordered her not to, presumably the money stitched into the Perigo's bed. Miss Blythe also said that Rebecca would rise from the grave to stroke her husband's face with her right hand, and that William would lose the use of one side, but that Miss Blythe would pray for him. Of course, he should also burn the letter immediately after having read it. Was Mary paving the way for another murder attempt, attributable to a stroke perhaps? She certainly had a problem on her hands with William having survived her previous attempt, and he had unwittingly thwarted another bid in not telling Mary he was taking a curative trip to the Spa of Buxton on the instruction of his surgeon, Mr. Chorley. It may be asked, however, as to why William chose not to avail himself of one of those more northerly spas, resorts, such as Harrogate, or even Ilkley, around Croft-on-Tees, or even those in Leeds itself, like Quarry Hill. Perhaps he preferred to distance himself somewhat from the recent traumas accumulated in the death of his wife. On his return from taking the waters, Mary upbraided the widower for not telling her what he was going to do and where he had been. Had she known he was to take a journey, she would have given him a bottle, the contents of which would have cured him on the road. Assuredly, the contents of that bottle would have done little to cure William Perigo. After returning to Bramley, he continued to receive letters from Miss Blythe, full of renewed demands. Her powers of perception were great indeed, as in looking at William's planet, She had seen his return from Buxton and was sorry, but if he had stayed a few days longer, he would have had the opportunity of meeting Miss Blythe there herself. All of Mary's nefarious deeds notwithstanding, she must be congratulated for the power of her imagination, as the incident she concocted to explain the necessity of Miss Blythe's fictional trip to Buxton was outlandish, to say the least. Apparently, Miss Blythe had been injured when she and her brother had been thrown from their open carriage when the horse-drawing it took fright at the sight of a hot air balloon. Astutely covering all the possible loopholes in her story, Mary was even meticulous enough to make sure that the next letter received from Miss Blythe was headed and dated as being written from Buxton. The small matter of the absence of a Buxton postmark explained away by Miss Blythe having enclosed her letter with another bound for Bradford, the letter to William having been posted on from there. In the Buxton letter, Miss Blythe directed William to take one of his wife's gowns to Mary Bateman in Leeds, from whence it would be delivered to her in Buxton, though clearly the dress he chose did not meet with Mary's approval, as in the next letter received in October, Miss Blythe berated William for sending her such a shabby gown, especially when she knew she had one better. Apparently, the planets enabled Miss Blythe to assess the contents of a dead woman's wardrobe too. Requesting instead one of Mrs. Perigo's best gowns, along with a petticoat and a skirt, Miss Blythe also required the Perigo family Bible be sent to her for her to sit upon in the coach when she arrived from Buxton, the reason for which remains a puzzle. We can assume that the family Bible, extorted by Mary from the serving girl forced to steal from her mother, back in the days when she was casting fortunes while living in Marsh Lane, had long since been pawned. Two further letters received by William in October contained various requests for a guinea and a half to buy a waggon load of coals, specifically to be purchased from a Mr. Fenton's near Leeds, in addition to 1 stone and a half of flour, 4 ounces of tea, a pound or 2 of sugar, and a quantity of eggs, one of which was to be blown and a guinea note inserted into the empty shell for a particular use, presumably lying in Mary's pocket. And Miss Blythe's missives continued until September 1808, latterly defending Mary Bateman's good character and with hollow promises of the return of the moneys laid out. Finally, William Perigo investigated the silken bags which had been stitched into his and Rebecca's bed. Perhaps he was understandably short on money. On the 19th of October, he steeled himself and opened them all. He must have recalled all the occasions when he had received from Mary a silk bag in which he believed her to have attached or stitched what was purported to be coins and notes he had made over the instruction of Miss Blythe. One wonders whether, in his heart of hearts, he was entirely surprised to find that inside the bag, where he expected to find guinea notes, he found only scrap paper, and halfpennies and farthings, where he expected to find gold coins. Even worse, the 4 bags containing the guinea notes that were first to have been stitched into the bed were missing entirely. Now the game was really up, and William Perigo went to Leeds to confront Mary Bateman. Of course, this wasn't the first time that Mary had been faced with an accusation of deception, and a predictable retort to William with regard to now worthless contents of silk bags was that you've opened them too soon, breaking the magic of the charm and causing the contents to be magically changed into values that were no longer valuable. William responded, I think it is too late, and she said he would return the following morning in company with 2 or 3 men to settle the matter. Though alarmed, Mary must have thought that her powers of manipulation might yet still have some effect, and begged that a private meeting be arranged on the bank of Leeds and Liverpool Canal in the following morning, where she assured William that she would satisfy him. Though poorer, William Perigo was nevertheless now wiser. He agreed to the meeting with Mary the following day, but had no intentions of going alone. This was a prudent precaution, because as the canal side meeting played out, it was clear that Mary had intended to eliminate William once and for all. One of the 2 men he asked to accompany him was William Duffield, the Chief Constable of Leeds. Clearly Perigo was by this time highly suspicious of the ever-growing demands of Miss Blythe and her ingenuine go-between. As the man who had once been of some means, it was natural that he should inform the authorities. Mary had bitten off more than she could chew this time. Both men kept a discreet distance, but when Mary discovered their presence, she feigned an attack of vomiting and accused William Perigo of having given her a bottle of poisonous liquid, which she had in fact brought along herself. During her examination before Leeds magistrates, Mary alleged that William had given her a bottle the night before her arrest, and while her husband did not ever take any of it, she did, and was very ill after it. On later analysis, the bottle was found to contain a mixture of oatmeal and arsenic, and was presumably intended to silence William Perigo for good. Chief Constable Duffield was not impressed by Mary's charade, however, and promptly took her into custody. The mechanics of Mary's arrest and detention are far from clear. The Extraordinary Life skates over them, presumably because its readers would know how the system worked. The Borough Co-operation Act and the later Constabulary Act meant that more modern police forces were set up, sweeping away the old. We know that the Chief Constable appointed in 1836 to head up the new force in Leeds already held a similar position, but the size and exact nature of his old force is not specified. Mary would have been taken into custody by constables of the watch, Charlies as they were known, because the post had been set up in the reign of Charles II. These men were barely literate, as some of them not physically up to the job of chasing criminals, and they were under the control of Duffield, whose job was honourably and unpaid. There were no women in any police force as early as this, although for delicate jobs such as searching Mary's person, a local civilian female was probably drafted in. William then accompanied Duffield to Mary's house, where a search revealed many of the items bought by the Perigos and supposedly sent to Miss Blythe in Scarborough, were in fact actually in Mary's possession. Amongst them, the bed, tea caddy, a set of china purchased in April of the previous year, along with various other items including articles of clothing, 2 or 3 hat boxes, some sacking in which malt had been delivered, and a pair of pincers, presumably those used to hammer home the horseshoe-shaped pieces of iron over Perigo's front door, one of the earliest charms recommended by Miss Blythe. Clearly there was no way that Mary could talk herself out of this damning predicament. She was brought before the Leeds magistrates the following day, charged with fraud and other, undergoing several long examinations. She in part confessed her delinquency and admitted there was no such person as Miss Blythe in existence, but that the whole was a mere phantom, conjured up to forward her vile purposes. It was clear, however, that she was guilty of more than fraud. Mary was held pending the investigation into the suspicious death of Rebecca Perigo. The magistrates, whose name is not given in the Extraordinary Life, was a local gentleman who worked, as did many law officers, in an unpaid capacity for the good of the community. Mary had no defence counsel, either at this arrangement or her later trial, and there were no rules governing how evidence was obtained. She clearly underwent hours of questioning, and only had her wits to keep her going. Though Mary was arrested toward the end of October 1808, it was the 6th of January 1809 before the murder charges were formally laid, after which time she was committed to York Castle Gaol, where she awaited trial on suspicion of the wilful murder of Rebecca, which she had brought about more than 18 months before. Depending on the severity of the accusation, prisoners could spend some considerable time on remand awaiting trial before the assize courts or great sessions, as these were normally held in York only twice a year during Lent and summer. Judges rode on horseback from one county on to the next, trying all those charged with criminal offences too serious to be dealt with by magistrates at the quarter sessions. At these assize courts, capital offences were heard, crimes including murder, manslaughter, rape as well as treason, major fraud or theft, arson, riot and rebellion. Guilt on any of these counts carried the death penalty before 1836, the year in which capital punishment was abolished for crimes other than those of murder, attempted murder, in theory at least, treason. Mary would have been detained in York's female prison, which had been built in 1780 next to the debtors' prison, in a bid to ease the Gauls' overcrowding. At the end of the 17th century, it was decided to build a new prison inside the bailey of York Castle, and York commenced on the new County Gaol, which opened in 1705, having taken 4 years to build. This building became known as the debtors' prison, but proved inadequate with regards to the increase in prisoner population. The impressive facade of the female prison mirrored the architecture of the newly appointed County Court opposite, designed by John Carr, and completed 3 years earlier in 1777. This was where Mr. Justice Simon Leblanc would preside over Mary's trial during the Lent Assizes, which opened on Friday, the 17th of March, 1809. At this point, with Mary's court case pending, we must examine the knowledge and extent of John Bateman's involvement in his wife's criminal activities. Mr. Snowdon, whose house in Leeds had been left in Mary's care, had happened to see the newspaper article concerning Mary's arrest, and had hurried back to Leeds from Bradford to discover that his home had been plundered of just about every item he owned. On the issue of a search warrant, as some of the Snowdons' belongings were found in the Bateman's house, along with those of the Perigos, John Bateman was arrested. It's difficult to believe, but at no point did he question his wife as to the influx of furniture and goods in their house, clearly not their property. If Mary had indeed bought the items herself, where had she found the money to do so? And his was not a capital offence. John Bateman's case would have been heard at the next quarter session, the Leeds Charter of Incorporation of 1661 having given the borough the right to hold its own quarter and petty sessions, which were independent of the West Riding courts. As the name suggests, quarter sessions were county courts held by magistrates 4 times a year, dealing with criminal matters from petty theft, along with administrative matters such as licensing. Unfortunately, there was a gap in the order, and the indictment books for Leeds quarter sessions for that period, 1809 to 1844. So we don't know. We do know, however, from the account of Mary's trial, that John Bateman was imprisoned, pending his own appearance at the next session. The fact that he was acquitted as either principal or accomplice to Mary's crime was thought at the time more on account of his good luck than good conduct. But up to this point, he was considered to have been of irreproachable character, having been in the same employment for 16 years, noted for the sobriety of his conduct and his close application to business, not having lost a single day during the whole of that period, except when he visited friends. After all, John himself had been practised upon by his own wife. He could not surely have been entirely ignorant of Mary's frauds, as he had collected her bedstead purchased by the Perigos from Miss Blythe's, from where it was being kept by Mr. Sutton, at the Lion and Lamb Inn on Kirk Gate, allegedly waiting collection by the boatman and Miss Blythe's brother, taking the bedsteads to his employer's workshop, and then on to their home in Water Lane, on inquiry. John claimed to have bought the bedstead himself. Though cleared of the charges against him, things did not end well for John Bateman. In spite of all the money that Mary had extorted over the years, she didn't enrich her family. Her husband was left in extreme poverty, his debts unpaid, and eventually his house was broken up and his furniture sold. With regard to John Bateman's culpability in the knowledge of the murder, or perhaps we should say murders, perpetrated by his wife, which in view of Mary's history must have been pluralised, even though she was only tried and convicted of the single murder of Rebecca Perigo. We cannot know if he was free from all or any criminal covenants in the acts, only that he was never placed on trial as an accessory. At this juncture, we must look at the prevalent contemporary chauvinistic attitude to female criminality, another moralising gem drawn from the extraordinary life, that, as women, were naturally much more amiable, tender and compassionate than other sex, and they become when they pervert the dictates of nature, more remorseful and cruel, and can conceive and execute the most diabolical of crimes, summed up the feeling of the age. Mary's guilt and guile was doubtless viewed as wholly in accord with the universal view, and while criminality held a certain fascination in the 19th century, still does, as we shall see in the concluding chapter, murder represents the ultimate appalling act, and murders committed by women have always been regarded as more shocking, since women were regarded as the weaker sex, legally passing or their owned to their husbands with their wedding vows. A situation in which a woman was exposed as a murderer violated their femininity, turned the world upside down. Literally, that's how people felt. Women were not meant to do those things. The law was harsher, society more outraged by a female killer than a male. In court, these women were tried as individuals and allowed to give their own testimony. Even modes of execution personified and inequality of the sexes. A stark example was that while hanging was the standard capital punishment for a husband who murdered his wife, the ultimate inequality was excised in the sentencing of wives who murdered their husbands, as those found guilty of marricide were executed by strangulation and their bodies then burned at the stake under the old Tudor law of petty treason. The last person to be executed in this way in Yorkshire was Elizabeth Boardingham, a death penalty carried out at York's Tyburn on the 20th of March, 1776. Mary was to be tried at York Crown Court opposite the female prison in which she was held on Friday the 17th of March 1809, charged with the wilful murder of Rebecca Perigo of Bramley in the West Riding in the month of May 1807. Mary appeared in the dark, packed courtroom it was, before the presiding judge, Sir Simon Le Blanc, wearing scarlet robes lined with ermine and full-bottom wig in the 17th century style. Le Blanc appeared as the face of justice, while literacy levels were increasing among the population. The late 18th and early 19th centuries was still a visual culture, and the importance of visual symbolism was not lost for judicial system, with the importance of spectacle evoking awe from ordinary men, as asserted by Judge William Blackstone in the commentaries published in 1831. The novelty and very parade of a judge's appearance having no small influence on the multitude. The black cap was placed on the judge's head when he pronounced the death sentence. The royal coat of arms flashed a gilded power on the wall behind him. Le Blanc was a graduate of Trinity Hall, Cambridge, and had been called to the bar of the Inner Temple in 1773. In 1799 he was knighted and appointed as a judge on the King's Bench. As the trial got underway, Mr. Williams opened the case for the prosecution. Mr. John Hardy, recorded for the borough of Leeds, who would later go into politics, then addressed the jury telling them that he had to detail circumstances of an extraordinary folly on the one hand and of iniquity on the other, as ever came before a court of justice. And while the event which occasioned the accused prosecution had taken place nearly 2 years previously, he would nevertheless be able to show his evidence why the case had not been brought sooner, a case he described as ranking amongst the most artful and diabolical that ever entered the human imagination. The jury, whose names we do not know, was made up of 12 men, and true who would have been property holders in Leeds area. In theory, at least, they would have no prior connection with the case. The pivotal aspect of the case was whether or not Mary Bateman had actually supplied the poisons, any poisonous powders at least, which had killed Rebecca Perigo, whether she knew them to be poison. Hardy pursued the line that, in defrauding of the Perigos, Mary knew that she would not escape detection forever, and had therefore decided to apply poison to avoid exposure and punishment. If Mary's plans had worked, the Miss Blythe correspondence would have been destroyed. Both Perigos would have been found dead in their own home, the victims of a tragic suicide pact, to which they had been reduced by poverty. As matters stood, it was Providence that the life of William Perigo had been preserved, Mary Bateman disclosed as an impostor and a cheat. Hardy dwelt on the destruction of Miss Blythe's letters, and while in the most instances the Perigos had done as they had been instructed, William had committed the contents of those letters burnt to memory. The two surviving letters that he hadn't consigned to fire, dated 12th and 28th of August 1808, and purported to have come from Miss Blythe, were proven to be in Mary's hand. Summoned to give evidence in court, the prosecution produced John Bateman's employer, Mr. Wright, as a witness. He confirmed that the letters shown to him were in Mary's handwriting, he having been acquainted with the accused for 17 years. He may have seen Mary's earliest written fraud when she was hurried to Wright's premises nearly 15 years earlier, carrying the forged letter with the news that her husband's father was near death. The false pretext, which had allowed her to strip and sell the contents of the marital home in John Bateman's absences all those years ago. The prosecution further eluded the instruction that if the Perigos were to fall ill as a consequence of taking the powders supplied by Miss Blythe and given them by Mary, they were on no account to seek medical advice. It was also noted the date in 1807 on which the Perigos were to start using the powders, the 11th of May, which, also convenient, allowing a comfortable margin before Mary was supposed to have made reparation to the Perigos on behalf of Miss Blythe in the sum of £20. This was to have been on the 20th of the month, by which time she anticipated that the couple would be dead. Hardy drew attention to the instruction in another of Miss Blythe's letters, dated the 5th of May, urging the Perigos not to let the boy who regularly ate with them eat any of the puddings. Hardy put it to the jury that this may have been compassion on Mary's part, but more likely that a child would show the symptoms of poisoning more quickly. This would not only put the Perigos on their guard, it may have put the authorities on to Mary all the sooner. These points, coupled with the direction that Perigos should start taking the poison-saturated honey, if any ill effects did come about, caused Hardy to explain. Can any person after this entertain a doubt that the prisoner at the bar wished their destruction? As the trial, which was to last 11 hours, proceeded, indictment after damning indictment was presented. From the thorough search made by constables in Scarborough, which had revealed, predictably, that no such person as Miss Blythe existed, to the discovery of arsenic pills found in Bateman's house in Water Lane, when the premises were searched after Mary had initially been taken into custody. Of the witnesses called by prosecution, Sarah Stead, Rebecca Perigo's niece, was the first to take the stand. It was she who had, innocently enough, remembered the service of Mary Bateman to her distressed aunt. Her testimony was followed by the examination of William Perigo, which occupied upward of 4 hours. After the full relation of his and his wife's dealings with Mary Bateman, Judge LeBlanc asked him whether he was certain of what he had advanced on these points, to which Perigo replied, "I'll abide by it while I live, and I will abide by it in another world forever." Various other witnesses were called to testify, amongst them Thomas Dobbin, from whom William Perigo had bought Miss Blythe's bed and bedstead, and William Hick, a bookkeeper at the Leeds coach office, who recalled William Perigo bringing in a parcel addressed to Miss Blythe. Centre Hotel, Buxton. He related how 3 weeks later a woman came in to the coach office to inquire after the parcel, presumed by Mary, who must have expected the parcel to have been returned to Leeds, as the recipient did not exist. However, an oversight on the part of the Hick meant that the return of the parcel was delayed until Mary's arrest, and when the parcel was firmly recovered and the contents investigated, it just so happened to contain the Perigo family Bible, demanded by Miss Blythe the previous October. Detrimental testimonies continued to issue from the witness stand. Winifred Bond, who was employed by Mary to run various errands, stated that she frequently took letters to the post offices in different towns for her. She was a perfect choice on Mary's part, as conveniently Winifred could not read. She had on several occasions taken letters over to Bramley to deliver to the Perigos, and often returned with items such as brewing tubs, malt, flour, tea. She stated Mary was quite implicit to what Winifred should say if William Perigo were ever to question her, that she should tell him she was employed by Miss Blythe, as a domestic for her house in Full Neck, which at the time had a flourishing Moravian church, about 5 miles west of the centre of Leeds. In fact, Winifred lived in Haworth, near Keighley, not yet the home of the Brontes, having been obliged to leave Leeds at Mary's request. When Judge LeBlanc asked the witness how Mary Bateman had obliged her to quit her home in Leeds, Winifred replied that she was afraid, fearing the supernatural powers which she supposed Mary to possess. When Rose Howgate, neighbour to Perigo's, a long-time friend of Rebecca's, was called to the witness stand, she told the court as she had visited at 10 o'clock on the morning of the fateful Saturday, when the final pudding had been prepared with the last packet of poisonous powder. She found the couple well and Rebecca doing some washing. However, when she returned later that afternoon, she found both William and Rebecca very unwell indeed and vomiting, and that the colour of what came from them was green and yellow and very frothy, added to which she could hear her neighbour's continuous vomiting from her own home next door. Over the course of the following week, Rose Howgate had continued with enabling ministrations until Rebecca's death on the Sunday following. Being present when the deceased was laid out, Rose noted that the body was covered in every part with black and white spots, but particularly about the neck and stomach. Rebecca's lips were also exceedingly black, and a great quantity of froth issued from the mouth. Her body was so offensive that every person about her was under the necessity of smoking. In the days before inherent health risks of tobacco were identified, smoking pipes or taking out snuff was often employed as a way of masking foul smells. Clearly suspicious of the cause and circumstances surrounding Rebecca's death, it was Rose Howgate and another neighbour, John Rogerson, who had taken upon themselves the idea of experimentally feeding some of the poison pudding to a cat. The poor creature died after vomiting yellow and green matter. John Rogerson was present at the assizes with a Joshua Stockdale, possibly Rebecca's brother. Her maiden name was Stockdale. When William Perigo opened the silk purses that were supposed to have contained the guinea notes and coins, it was also Joshua Stockdale who had accompanied William Perigo, along with Chief Constable Duffield, to the canal, side meeting arranged with Mary Bateman. He verified the conversation that had taken place between them before Mary had been taken into custody. Further evidence of Mary's procurement of poison was provided by 11-year-old Thomas Grisley, who remembered that about 2 years previously he had accompanied Jack Bateman, Mary's son, who would himself have been 11 years old at the time, in April 1807 to Mr. Clough's apothecary shop in Kirkgate. At this time, the sale of drugs and poisons was practically unrestricted, and they could be bought like any other commodity. Arsenic often being employed in pest control. In this instance, when Jack Bateman handed over the paper upon which was written the request for 4d worth of arsenic, and Mr. Clow had refused to sell it to the boy, saying that it was poison, even though Jack Bateman maintained it was to be used to kill bugs with. The most damning witness testimony came, however, from Thomas Chorley, a practising surgeon of nearly 17 years standing from Call Lane in Leeds, who was listed in the Leeds Directory of 1798 under the psychic section. It was Charlie who had examined William Perigo on the day after his wife's death, he having fallen ill after eating but a single mouthful of the sick Saturday pudding and just 2 teaspoons of the special honey, and had noticed symptoms indicative of poisoning in his patient. Charlie had also analysed the contents of the jar of honey from which Rebecca had eaten so freely. His personal observations and tests he had carried out on the dog were all indicative of poison. He also carried out analysis of the bottle found in Mary's possession on the day of her arrest, which he had arranged to meet William Perigo at the canal side. The bottle and its contents were produced in court, and the solution confirmed as a spirituous liquid, probably rum, but also containing 2 powders, the lighter of which it was supposed was oatmeal, while the other was arsenic. In addition to the testimony provided by Charlie, 2 further expert witnesses from the medical fraternity were called to the stand and examined regarding the symptoms that Rebecca had suffered before her death. Dr. Lawson of York and Mr. James Lucas, formerly a consulting surgeon of Leeds, but at the time of Mary's trial practising in Marsham, both concurred in their opinions. From the evidence they had heard, Rebecca Perigo's death could not have arisen from any natural disease. and that her symptoms were such as would be produced by corrosive sublimate of mercury being received into the stomach. It would appear that Mary had covered her bases and had employed 2 different poisons, a sublimate of mercury and the special honey which Charlie had identified, and arsenic to lace the pudding powders. At this juncture, the verdict seemed to foregone conclusion. Mary had no counsel, no recourse to explain or contradict the evidence presented, with any satisfactory testimony of her own, other than that taken down in her examination by the Leeds magistrate subsequent to her arrest, and now read before the court. The lopsided, not to say unfair, nature of the judicial system in 1809 is exposed by this. Justice was supposed to be blind and impartial, its scales weighed by evidence. Despite the acquisition of the considerable sums of money over the years from various scams, Mary could probably not afford a lawyer. Given the prosecution's evidence and the witnesses called, he would have had his work cut out to sway a jury. But stranger things have happened. Let us for a moment assume that Mary did have counsel. What would they have done? Initially, he would have denied all the charges. After identifying them on Mary's behalf, would have cross-examined the prosecution witness, probably challenged Wright's assertion, and then Miss Blythe's letters were in Mary's handwriting. How would he challenge that? Wright was not a graphology expert, and there's still huge controversy about the handwriting and what it can tell us forensically. The barrister would then have called into question the competence of the Scarborough police for being able to find Miss Blythe. There was no doubt that, had the woman been genuine, her psychic powers would have made her reclusive and not the sort to be listed in the town's directories. It may have also put a doubt into the jurors' minds about the Leeds police search of the Bateman's house, which had produced the arsenic pills. We've already established that arsenic had conventional household users at the time, and that it's, before any assertion, later commonplace of the police planting evidence to bolster their case is a possibility also. Sarah Stead offered nothing incriminating other than that she had introduced Mary to her aunt, so the defence counsel might have let her off lightly. William Perigo would have spent far longer than his 4 hours in the witness box. A good brief would have had every sympathy for the man's loss, so that he should not alienate the jury, but would point out that for most of Miss Blythe's correspondences the court only had William's memory, and this was not sufficient. Even the prosecution had alluded to an extraordinary folly on Perigo's part, and a clever defence lawyer could have pushed this to the point where the man appeared an imbecile whose testimony could not be relied upon. The calling of Thomas Dobbin as a witness would merely have served to prove Perigo's stupidity. The man had bought a bed from him, which takes us nowhere near the assumption of murder. In the case of William Hick, the bookkeeper at the Leeds coach office, if Mary was the woman who had called to collect a parcel addressed to Miss Blythe, why didn't he point her out in court? Winifred Bond's testimony could easily have been demolished. She was illiterate and afraid of Mary. On Ebert's score, defence counsel could have called into question her reliability. Rose Howgate's testimony did not point to Mary at all. She'd seen the pudding preparation and witnessed the poison's effects, but Mary, of course, was nowhere to be seen. The defence would have pointed this out too. Little Thomas Grizzly was almost irrelevant. It's unlikely that children's testimony was not taken seriously as adults in courts of the day, and all the boy had done was to witness Mary's son trying to buy arsenic, ostensibly for legal reasons, to kill bugs with. Circumstantial evidence like this has hanged people, but it has acquitted them too. The defence counsel would probably have had most difficulty with Mr. Chorley, the surgeon, but he would have found an expert witness of his own, who would have rebutted Chorley's findings. The later infamous poisoning cases of the century, Charles Bravo, James Maybrick, the many victims of William Palmer, all produced rebuttal witnesses of this type. All of the science would, in all probability, have gone straight over the heads of the jury, so the issue would have come down to personalities, both the dueling doctors and the clashing counsel. As it was, there was no defence counsel. Under the law as it stood, Mary was not allowed to speak in her own defence. so the arraignment testimony had to suffice. It said that it had been more than 3 years since she'd been in Leeds, variously residing in Manchester, Bedale, Richmond, Masham, and that she had not been in Leeds when William Perigo claimed he had been instructed to bring her the half, a peck of wheat, amongst various items extorted from the Perigos, at the behest of Miss Blythe. She herself had contributed half the money toward the purchase of the cheese, presumably the £6 to £8 one requested in Miss Blythe's letter of October 1806, and that she never had any honey or powders, and that Rebecca Perigo never bought any honey pot to her. She had never spoken to either husband or wife about any honey, and neither her husband nor anyone never fetched any powder. In short, a defensible, straightforward denial of any involvement in the death of Miss Rebecca, Mary insisting that it was utterly false, and that she ever did send for any poison by any person. Any avenue of opportunity in shifting the blame to Miss Blythe had already been closed off, of course, when the constables in Scarborough had failed to find any such a person. In fact, Mary had already admitted to Leeds magistrates that there was, in fact, no such person as Miss Blythe in existence. Indeed, during the arraignment at Leeds, Mary also stated that all the letters were written by Hannah Potts, except the last 5 or 6, whether Hannah Potts really existed, perhaps as an acquaintance of Mary's, or was merely another invention on her part like Miss Blythe, we'll never know. In this summing up of the case, Sir Simon Le Blanc reminded the jury that, to bring in a guilty verdict, they had to satisfy themselves on 3 points. These were that Rebecca Perigo had died from poisoning, that the poison had been administered with the knowledge and contrivance of Mary Bateman, and that it had been done in the expectation of causing Rebecca Perigo's death. The jury, as was always the case in those days, was entirely male, and the judge went on to remind them to render an impartial verdict, and that, although there was a strong case against Mary for having systematically defrauded the Perigos, this did not automatically make her guilty of murder. However, in view of the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution, after conferring for a very short time, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. Accordingly, Judge Le Blanc placed the black cloth sentencing cap over his powdered wig and proceeded to pass sentence of death. Mary Bateman, you have been convicted of wilful murder by a jury who, after examining your case with caution, have constrained by the force of evidence, pronounced you guilty. It only remains for me to fulfil my painful duty by passing upon you the awful sentence of the law. After you have been so long in the situation in which you now stand, and harassed as your mind must be by the long detail of your crimes and by listening to the sufferings you have occasioned, I do not wish to add to your distress by saying more than my duty renders necessary. Of your guilt there cannot remain a particle of doubt in the breast of anyone who has heard your case. You entered into a long, premeditated system of fraud, which you carried on for a length of time, which is most astonishing, and by means which one would have supposed could not, in this age and nation, have been practised with success. To prevent a discovery of your complicated fraud and punishment, which must have resulted therefore, you deliberately contrived the death of the persons you had so grossly injured, and that by means of poison, a mode of destruction against which there is no sure protection. But your guilty design was not fully accomplished, and after so extraordinary a lapse of time, you are reserved as a signal example of the justice of the mysterious providence, which, sooner or later, overtakes guilt like yours. At the very time when you were apprehended, there is the greatest reason to suppose that if your surviving victim had met you alone, as you had wished him to do, you would have administered to him a more deadly dose, which would have completed the diabolical project you had long before formed, but which at that time only partially succeeded, for upon your person at that moment was found a vial containing a most deadly poison. For crimes like yours, in this world, the gates of mercy are closed. You afforded your victims no time for preparation, but the law, while it doomed you to death, has, in its mercy, afforded you time for repentance and the assistance of pious and devout men, whose admonitions and prayers and counsels they assist to prepare you for another world, where even your crimes, if sincerely repented of, may find mercy. The sentence of the law is, and the court doth award it, that you be taken to the place from whence you came, and from thence on Monday next to the place of execution, there to be hanged by the neck until you are dead, and that your body be given to the surgeons to be dissected and anatomized. And may Almighty God have mercy upon your soul. With regard to the stipulation of Mary's sentence concerning dissection, 1752, the Act for the better preventing the horrid crime of murder, more commonly known as the Murder Act, mandated the dissection of bodies of executed murderers, including females, though the gibbeting of the remains of male malefactors was still reserved for those found guilty of particularly heinous or high-profile crimes. Dissection was viewed in a very real horror, a practice formerly prohibited by Catholic Church. After the English Reformation of the 16th century, as medical research grew, so did the need for cadavers. By the 1700s in England, the bodies of executed criminals and the unclaimed poor were given over to feed the need of surgical teaching schools and hospitals. The legal supply of corpses for anatomical purposes did not provide enough subjects, and eventually the demand for cadavers for medical use outstripped the supply. In 1812, there were 26 medical students in Great Windmill Street, London, alone. Body snatching, the gruesome trade of the resurrection men, became a lucrative sphere of criminal activity in itself. Certainly the sentence of dissection increasing the deterrent effect of the death penalty by preying on the very real dread felt by most of the population at the thought of disembodiment after death. The prevalent and strong belief that dissection and the desecration of the decreased body, rendering it incomplete, would prevent an individual's entry into heaven is not as archaic as would seem. When body snatching reached its zenith, with the resurrection men working overtime to exhume the bodies of the recently dead, it was not unusual for relatives and friends of someone who had just died to watch over the body until burial, and then to keep watch over the grave after interment, to stop it from being removed and violated. Iron coffins, too, were frequently used. All the graves were protected by a framework of iron bars called moat safes. Watchtowers were even built within some cemeteries, and night watchmen employed to deter those intent on their gory trade. Indeed, in some cases, the public feeling against the practice was so strong that bodies were frequently saved from the surgeon's table by a surge of angry crowds intent on snatching the body away post-execution, ensuring an intact Christian burial. One notable case to point out is the cadaver of celebrity criminal Dick Turpin, executed on York's Knavesmere gallows in 1739 before a vast crowd, appreciative of his final bravado in the shadow of the noose. In spite of being buried in a very deep grave in the churchyard of St. George's, Turpin's body was later found, disinterred, and in the garden of one of the city surgeons. However, the dissectionists were thwarted, and after keeping Turpin's body in the Blue Bar Inn overnight, in those days a public house, often had a room that was used as a temporary mortuary. To prevent any further body-snatching attempts, Turpin was reburied in St. George's churchyard. At this time the coffin was filled with unslaked quicklime. The first to suffer the post-mortem fate of dissection after the Murder Act came into force on the 1st of June, 1752, was 17-year-old Thomas Wilford, found guilty of the murder of his wife. Wilford had stabbed to death just 1 week after their wedding. He was executed on the 22nd of June, 1752, hanged upon London's infamous Tyburn Tree, the site of which today occupied by a marble arch. In the case of Mary Bateman's execution was scheduled for the Monday following the trial. It was usual for all those prisoners condemned at the previous sizes to await the next scheduled day of execution, and then be hanged in groups, irrespective of gender. In York, Monday was a designated day for murderers to be hanged, while the execution of other criminals was kept back for Saturdays, as this allowed for the largest weekend crowds. Yet she still had one last trick up her sleeve. When the clerk of the arraigns asked Mary Bateman, "What have you to say why immediate execution should not be awarded against you?" Mary burst into floods of tears and announced to the court she was 22 weeks pregnant. And that's the end of this part of Mary Bateman. We shall continue with the next part and find out if this is actually true. Because it's interesting that she would state that, right? I mean, obviously she would. Why would she not? But it's the only thing that can get you out of it, you see. At least for some time, anyway. But we shall see. Thank you for listening, and many blessings.